we go. Well, welcome everybody to the latest edition of Public Justice Center's Justice for Breakfast series. I'm John Nethercutt. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Justice Center. And I'll turn off my phone. Glad to have you all here today. Since the pandemic, we've been doing this on Zoom, and we've noted that we've actually had higher attendance than usual than we used to in person, and I guess that's a good thing, although the method of doing this is a little bit different. So as Kathleen says, we are recording. Turn off your video if you don't want to be seen. And please, in the chat box, put any questions you have, and I'll watch the questions and call on you or rephrase your question for you, and I'll try to facilitate it. We're going to go until about 10 o'clock today, and then we'll get off because Monisha has to go testify. And the program today is going to be on police in our school system. It is going to be led by Monisha Sharial, who is the lead attorney of our Education Stability Project. She's going to have a PowerPoint to go through first, and then we'll be open for questions and answers and discussion. And like I say, if you have any questions or anything, put them in the chat and we'll keep an eye on it. Otherwise, please keep yourself on mute. And with that, let me turn it over to Monisha.
Hey everyone, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for joining us. As John said, I'm our leader of our Education Stability Project here at the PJC, which is focused on dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline in Maryland. And today I'll be talking about a particular driver of that pipeline, and that is the institution of school police. Let me pull up my PowerPoint for you all.
And it probably helps people if you go to speaker view rather than gallery view to watch Monisha's PowerPoint.
Okay. Now, we didn't always have police in our schools. The first programs were established in the 50s in response to Black students integrating schools following the Great Migration and Brown v. Board. But they became more popular with the war on drugs and zero tolerance policies that followed. School policing really grew as a model in the early 2000s, following the Columbine and Sandy Hook school shootings, which infused substantial amounts of federal funding into the programs nationwide. Here in Maryland, we further expanded school policing in 2018 following the Great Mills High School shooting with the creation of an SRO grant funded by the state at $10 million per year, in addition to the millions more spent at the local levels. So, what this history tells us is that the current justification for school police is that we need them to stop school shootings and other serious violence, though they do have origins in issues of race and segregation. Now, the reality of their impact is quite different. Police presence has not been shown to deter armed shooters from targeting schools. Police have not been able to stop school shootings when they do occur. And school police also haven't reduced any other types of violence in schools. I'll quote you a couple of studies that I've been reviewing. One of approximately 3,000 schools nationwide found no evidence suggesting that SRO or other sworn law enforcement contribute to school safety. Another concluded that no empirical evidence supports the claim that school police stop shootings, and in many of the highest profile school shootings nationwide, the presence of armed officers failed to deter or stop shooters, as in the Parkland shooting. And a review of over 40 years of research found that with respect to any types of offenses in schools, the evidence fails to support a safety effect associated with officer presence. What school police have done, however, is to criminalize children for being children. A police officer's job, his or her sworn duty, is to enforce the law. And legally and by training, school police officers are police with the same powers and obligations as all officers, including to carry firearms and to arrest when they witness potential violations of the law. So, as a practical matter, through an officer's eyes, a run-of-the-mill fight is an assault. A child grabbing a friend's jacket and coloring on it is malicious destruction of property. Horseplay in the hallway is criminal disturbance of educational activity. These are real cases, by the way, of students arrested by school police in Maryland. And that's why children in schools with police are twice as likely to be arrested for a fistfight, 5 times as likely to be arrested for disorderly conduct. And that's why 70% of arrests here in Maryland schools are for these very types of relatively low-level misbehaviors. And arrest alone, or arrest followed by entry into the juvenile or criminal system, has been shown to derail a child's education. But even the prospect of arrest and the fear that some children, particularly students of color, feel when seeing police in the hallways can make it hard to focus on learning. That's why we see that school police presence has a negative impact on academic performance, as you see here. Now, just like police violence is a threat in our community, it's a threat in our schools as well. I provided here a handful of local examples of violence against children by police in schools, the last couple of which involve PJC clients. And there are many more. Now, it'll come as no surprise that these various harms are not inflicted evenly. Black students are disproportionately likely to attend a school with an officer or a school that has more police than mental health professionals. School staff are also more likely to perceive Black students as blameworthy, even when they engage in the same behaviors as white peers. That's why Black students receive 56% of school-based arrests in Maryland, despite comprising only 1/3 of the student population. Students with disabilities are also at elevated risk. They're targeted for 23% of our school-based arrests, even though they're only about 12% of our student population. And that's often because they face arrest for behaviors, even nonviolent behaviors, arising out of their disabilities. Of course, students at the intersection of those two groups are particularly vulnerable. And this next slide is actually a video clip from a recent news report from earlier this year that helps translate a lot of the impact and the research I've been sharing with you into a visual form that helps us really experience and better understand what the effect of the school policing model can be.
Jerome Liaison, now 12, has been diagnosed with autism. So in 2019, when he was moving to middle school, his aunt and guardian carefully looked for a school that could meet his needs. General John Stricker Middle School was the choice.
And they told us that they could meet his needs, so that's why we chose that school. Yes, you have to have a behavior plan for autistic children because you know, they act out in different ways than other children.
But just a few days into the school year, Jerome got into an argument with another student after he felt he was bullied. As a school employee took him to the office, he ran and then was taken to what's called a focus room.
Easy, buddy. Easy. Hi. Calm down.
A staff member reported Jerome was banging his head against the wall. Initially, he was restrained by a staff member holding him. But about 2 minutes later, the decision was made to handcuff Jerome by the school resource officer. This video is from the officer's body-worn camera. Jerome resisted, cursing, kicking, and crying.
They're made to be hard.
The handcuffs remained in place for about 23 minutes. His aunt believes it was an unnecessary use of force.
It was terrible. They treat him like a criminal, and he's only an artistic little boy.
A spokesperson for the Baltimore County school system defended the officer's response, saying in a statement, physical restraint is allowed when necessary to protect a student or another person from imminent serious physical harm after other less intrusive non-physical interventions have failed. The statement went on, police are called for support in emergency situations, and their response is dictated by county police best practices. County police referred to their use of force policy, which applies the same criteria to school resource officers. Handcuff restraint permitted to prevent someone from harming themselves or others. Sam Pulver is the family's lawyer.
And what we see in this video and what happened was just a complete systemic failure from start to finish about the appropriate way to deal with Jerome in this setting. The cherry on top being that a cop came in and put him in handcuffs, which was just under no circumstances should that ever been allowed to take place.
During the incident, Jerome complained of injury to his arm. The following day, he was treated for a broken bone in his right wrist. And to this day, his aunt says, Jerome is afraid of police.
If we go to Walmart or somewhere like that, Jerome stays in the car with my husband because he's afraid to even walk past the police officer.
The family also argues that the school failed to follow Jerome's individual education plan, his IEP, in de-escalating the incident. The family lawyer says a lawsuit is likely to be filed. Reporting live tonight in Dundalk, I'm Jane Miller, WBAL TV 11 News.
Okay. I'm sure folks have reactions and feelings and thoughts to share about that video, and I'm happy to loop back to it when we get to the discussion portion. But for now, I'll just say, Jerome and Ms. Merritt are clients of a colleague of mine at Disability Rights Maryland, which we partner with quite a bit, along with many other organizations in this work. And his story really helps to illustrate a number of the harms associated with maintaining a regular police presence in schools that we've been discussing. Now, from my perspective, and that of many of the students and parents and racial justice advocates and community members organizing around this issue, this evidence points to a fairly clear conclusion, which is that police presence in schools ultimately makes many students less safe, not more. And if we truly want to keep all kids safe, we have to employ alternative strategies. Now, what do those strategies look like? We don't have time for a comprehensive discussion, but I'll walk through just three. So first, restorative approaches, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. These are strategies to intentionally develop positive relationships among students and staff so that they truly care about one another, invest in one another, making it less likely that one will harm the other, and more possible to impose accountability and repair harm when it does occur. Studies have found that when faithfully implemented, restorative approaches work. Kids behave better, they don't hurt each other or school staff, arrest and suspension fall by the wayside. We actually saw this in a recent study in Baltimore City schools, where schools in a pilot program that implemented restorative approaches in a comprehensive way with a financial investment behind that saw a 44% decline in suspensions. But what we also see in this review of the literature is that approaches like reliance on school police can be fundamentally at odds with the restorative mindset and approach. A second strategy, social emotional learning. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's investing in teaching kids how to be self-aware, how to regulate their emotions, how to resolve conflict, how to empathize with each other. And this too has been shown to have positive near-term and long-term impacts on student behavior and reductions in violent conduct. Finally, for now, trauma-sensitive practices recognize that some kids act out and hurt others because they're hurting themselves. They've suffered trauma. And trauma-informed schools have the mental health services, the staff training, and the community partnerships to medical resources, food supports, housing programs to respond, ultimately making schools safer for everyone. But to implement these and other alternatives, we need not just policies and professional development, we need actual staff, counselors, social workers, school psychologists, restorative approaches practitioners, community school coordinators. And we need enough of them to serve our student population. But in Maryland, we're not meeting those recommended benchmarks. We don't have enough of these key partners, falling short of the standard ratios in some cases, and in many schools, some of the necessary positions simply don't exist at all. As a state, we're still relying on that school police model, which we know doesn't work. The racial justice protests of this summer started or restarted conversations around the country and here at home on the need for reform. School districts are finally listening to students and parents who have been demanding police-free schools for years, and growing numbers have decided to dismantle their school police forces and replace them with more effective supports, like many of those we discussed. And they're not alone. In 2017, Toronto Public Schools, Canada's largest school system serving around 250,000 students, decided to remove all police officers from its schools. And it did that in response to Black Lives Matter protests, which were highlighting many of the same types of concerns about overcriminalization and racial disproportionality that we've discussed today. I just want to highlight that Toronto Public Schools took an equitable approach to considering community input in making this decision. Most TPS students actually had a generally positive view of school police, but district leadership recognized that it was a minority of students, particularly Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students, and students with disabilities, that had had more interactions with these officers and experienced greater harm as a result of their presence. So it applied the principles of equity in education and gave greater weight to the views of this minority of marginalized kids in deciding to terminate the program. And the very encouraging news is that the sky has not fallen, far from it. There has been no increase in school-based violence, and TPS has actually seen decreases in suspension and expulsion rates and less involvement by police in disciplinary incidents. In other words, there hasn't been a spike in calls to city or county police when the school officers were removed. The police-free schools movement has taken hold in Maryland too. Grassroots, student, and community-driven campaigns for police-free schools are publicly underway in the 3 Maryland counties shown here. And in some cases, the advocacy is targeting the school board. In others, it's the county council. It depends on where the levers of power are in that particular jurisdiction. And the PJC and a number of coalitions we work within are supporting these efforts, following the lead of local organizers and plugging in where we can be most useful, providing testimony or research, doing legal analysis, developing fact sheets, speaking on panels, depending on what makes sense from the perspective of that community-driven effort. And Maryland's movement also includes a push for change in state level legislation. So a little bit of background on that. As I mentioned earlier, the Safe to Learn Act passed in 2018 after a shooting at Great Mills High in St. Mary's enshrined the school police model in our state level law. It requires all schools to have an SRO or adequate law enforcement coverage. And it creates a $10 million per year state SRO fund. Now, technically, Safe to Learn doesn't require SROs or school police in schools. Counties can opt to create an adequate law enforcement coverage plan, setting up a system for calling county or city police in an emergency. But the law encourages and incentivizes districts to go the SRO route, because relying on SROs is the simplest way to comply with its mandate, and because it puts millions of state dollars, again, 10 million in mandatory state funds per year into a fund which districts can then access. And in fact, every jurisdiction uses SROs at least in its high schools and in some middle schools. Now there's another statute that cements the school police model in our state law as well. That's section 4-318 of our education article, which creates a standalone police force within Baltimore City public schools. So in every other district, school police are actually employees of the city or county police departments who work in schools under a contract with the district and that police department. But city schools officers are employees of city schools itself. And they get a portion of that city schools education budget, close to $10 million per year in recent years. So the next two slides cover the two companion bills that PJC and several of our coalition allies are supporting, which together comprise the Reimagining School Safety package. The two bills in the package are the Counselors Not Cops Act, sponsored by Delegate Janelle Wilkins, and the Police Free Schools Act, sponsored by Delegate Gabe Acevero. Now, both bills redirect the $10 million per year state SRO fund towards student mental health services, wraparound supports, and restorative approaches, so we can implement those effective alternatives for keeping kids safe that we discussed earlier. They require reporting and use of force against students and districts' calls to outside police. And they strengthen the state school safety subcabinet advisory board to include families impacted by school-based arrest, experts in student mental health services, and conflict resolution, so that our school safety apparatus is really committed to looking at non-police school safety strategies. Now, in addition, the Police Free Schools Act seeks to end the damaging and ineffective school police model wholesale by prohibiting school districts from contracting with police departments to station officers in schools and dismantling the Baltimore City school police force. I do want to be really clear about what the bills do not do. They do not prohibit schools from calling city or county police in an emergency or from coordinating with outside police to do proactive safety planning or having regular communication. They do not prohibit school districts from developing those adequate law enforcement coverage plans with city or county police. They do not remove school security guards so long as they're unarmed and don't have the power to arrest students. And that's already the case in the vast majority of our jurisdictions. Prince George's County stands out in that not only do they have school police, they also have school security guards who do have arrest power. So our clients face arrest by both. And they do not prevent schools from installing door locks or other non-personnel physical safety measures, which are also funded by Safe to Learn, and our bills do not touch those provisions. So since we are short on time, I'll go ahead and stop here and get your questions. And And I'm also happy to walk through a number of the questions that we get from the communities, from the policymakers that we engage with on this issue. But let's start with yours.
If anyone has questions, please write them in the chat box, and we'll call them out.
So Adam asks,
Go ahead.
yeah, how do you find circuit court judges handle these situations? Do they understand the complexities? So when a student is arrested in school, if they are under 18, typically the first step will be that they will get a case with DJS. They'll do an intake with the Department of Juvenile Services. And PJC does represent students before DJS, oftentimes seeking to argue that formal charges should not be brought. There's a number of outcomes you can get as a result of the DJS meeting. You may get the case closed altogether, although the student will still have a DJS record, which certainly will come back and be a factor if they are ever arrested or have any sort of justice involvement again. You can end up with sort of a DJS supervised intervention where they have to engage in community service or access certain services or report back on how they're doing with school for a certain time period until the department determines that they've sort of learned their lesson from whatever happened. And then you can also end up with a situation where DJS goes ahead, forwards the case to prosecutors for charges in juvenile court, typically, sometimes adult court as well. Now, PJC does not represent students once they get to the charging stage. That is the function of the public defender or other criminal defense attorneys. So I don't have a great perspective on how circuit court judges sort of handle the cases once they get to that phase, beyond to say that sort of the complexities of working with juveniles and understanding sort of the impact of arrest and criminal involvement on their long-term prospects, I think is not well understood sort of across the board. There's studies showing that that each arrest can reduce the odds that a student graduates on time by 22 percentage points. And I think that's something that we have to do a good job of spreading the word about. The other piece that does come up is oftentimes, and again, I think the Office of the Public Defender has a lot of expertise here. But one thing I've seen come up is that kids can get into sort of this sort of trap where in the context of their ongoing juvenile case, they have to show that they're attending school regularly. They're not missing school. But that kid who has been arrested in school often ends up, if they're not getting the services they need in school, or if they've sort of become a target or been labeled as a bad kid, gets repeatedly suspended in school, so that they sort of fall into this trap where they've been pushed out of school by virtue of school-based arrests. They're trying to navigate the criminal system. They're dealing with the possibility of detention or actual detention. If they're not detained, they're trying to stay on track, but they can't do so because they're again being pushed out of school, whether it's through suspension or expulsion or school-based arrest. Any sense of the likely? The next question I see is, what level of support do these bills seem to have at the state level? So I'll say that, so the session just started a couple of weeks ago, but the Public Justice Center has been organizing as part of along with a number of other organizations since this summer around this issue. There are 3 large coalitions we're working within to support police-free schools at the state level, in addition to sort of many more partners that we work with at the local level who are also plugged into state efforts. So there's the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability. It includes about 90 organizations led by the ACLU, CASA, Jews United for Justice, and other sort of progressive advocacy organizations. They have put forth, or this coalition as a whole, we have put forth 5 demands for police reform. PJC is also supporting and supporting all 5 demands that all coalition members are. They include demands around repealing LEABOR, the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, expanding transparency for police misconduct records, giving Baltimore City control of its local police, and developing and establishing a use of force standard, and then finally removing police from school. So this 90+ organization coalition is really leading the push. We also work within the coalition for to reform school discipline and the Maryland Youth Justice Coalition, all of which, as you can sort of probably understand from the names of these coalitions, are focused and come at the issue of school policing from different angles, from the school discipline angle, or the youth justice angle, or the police reform angle. The school policing sits at the intersection of these different ongoing campaigns. So we've got a lot of allies, a lot of folks, student-led groups and parent-led groups have been organizing on this issue for years that are really pushing this. And we've met with a number of lawmakers since the summer. There's, and I'm happy to share, there's a sign-on letter that we sent to lawmakers over the summer that ended up with some 35+ lawmakers signing on in support of the 5 demands. We've had a number of meetings with lawmakers on the particular committees where these bills are likely to go, and have been educating. And then we've got sort of hearings coming up. I'll say that, you know, we're confronted with a tension, I think, between facts and feelings, and that's not to diminish feelings at all, but, you know, what we find among some lawmakers and even some community members is that, one, you know, most don't actually know a lot of the research that I shared about the true impact of school policing as a model. So it's certainly, I think, an important function for us to educate and provide that information. But for some, even when they hear that information, it's sort of in tension with not so much research or facts on the other side. There really isn't any. But sort of the fond associations that some folks have with their individual officers, or just the general sense that we need police in schools to prevent school shootings or other types of serious violence. It's not surprising, given that when we have had, you know, these horrific events occur, the one policy response that we as a nation have really offered up is an expansion of policing. So the two become intertwined in everyone's head. But that's sort of the challenge we come up against when we're talking to lawmakers, and we're really working all angles to try to educate. Okay. And I would, you know, and if for folks who are interested in the bills, there's a hearing on our Counselors Not Cops Act coming up next Wednesday, February 3rd at 1:30 p.m. in the Ways and Means Committee. So you can certainly tune into that, and then you'll get a sense of both sort of the support that we have in the committee, and we do have a number of folks in the committee who have expressed support, and also the questions and the concerns that come up on the other side. What work are you doing with teachers and school administrators to gain their support? To what extent do you believe that teachers and administrators support these bills? I think, yeah, it's a great question. We have a number of educators that we are working with and that have been deeply involved in the local efforts for police-free schools. So, for example, in Baltimore City, there's a educator group called Be More, you know, all Baltimore City schools, teachers, school social workers, other types of school-based staff that work with students that are pursuing a police-free schools campaign and supporting our legislation at the state level. In Howard County, there's the Anti-Racist Education Alliance, again, made up of teachers and actually some administrators who support this campaign and have seen how non-policing strategies are actually far more effective in achieving safety. The Prince George's County Education Association, so the teachers union in Prince George's County, officially supports police-free schools. At the national level, AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, also supports police-free schools. And we have a number of, individual teachers that may not be part of a particular association that are supportive. For example, one of the hearings I've got later today, I'll be presenting along with a former teacher who is also a parent with a student with disabilities, who I think has, heard the concerns from colleagues that have motivated the continued presence of police in schools, but also doesn't see them as a solution. So there absolutely is quite a bit of educator support. I will say that principals and administrators, at least in terms of their official union statements, so far, many have not, as sort of an official stance, been supportive. But as I mentioned earlier, there are some individuals we've connected with who are willing to sort of state that view publicly or privately. Okay. And I should say, a lot of these educators are then sort of on the front lines educating their partners, and we work with them to play that role. Another question we got: how can we ensure that the current funding, for example, for the police force in city schools, be reallocated to appropriate school resources, psychologists, etc., and not go to other purposes like general funds? Is this issue addressed in the proposed legislation? So in city schools, this, in some ways, it's easiest to shift that funding because the funding for the Baltimore City Police is in the Baltimore City Public Schools budget. That includes the portion of the $10 million it gets from the state, as well as the funding it expends locally, which, as I said, in the past several years has often been budgeted around $7 million, actually spent at around $9 million or greater. That's in the city schools budget. So if we didn't have the school police, it would remain in the city schools budget, and would be reallocated. Now, the city would have some, or rather city schools would have some discretion in how it reallocates the local portion of that funding, but our bill says that with respect to the state funding, that $10 million per year, it can only be used for certain purposes, i.e., hiring of social workers, counselors, school psychologists, expansion of restorative approaches, implementation of trauma-informed practices, development of community school models, and so forth. That's right in the legislation, and the funds cannot be used for other purposes. So I'm happy to also talk about, since I'm not seeing further questions, some of the other questions we get sort of typically, maybe they're on some of your minds, maybe you've heard them from others that you've spoken with. But, one of the big ones is that really this is just a training issue, right? And can't we just train school police not to over-arrest or harass students or engage in some of the other concerning conduct that we've discussed? And what I'd say is that that's not enough, because ultimately the function of police is to enforce the law and make arrests when they see crime, even when kids are involved. So that's why, we do see arrests in response to fighting, which in criminal terms is an assault. Grabbing another child's backpack, that's a theft or a robbery. Horseplay, which actually amounts to the crime in Maryland Code of disruption of education activities. And, the problems we've seen have occurred in districts where there has been training. State law requires 40 hours of training for school police officers on top of what they receive in the police academy, but clearly it's not been enough. So that's certainly a question that comes up. Another question that I think sort of drives some of the feelings that folks have about officers is really sort of personal experiences of individual students or parents with the officers in their schools, sort of playing a counseling role or connecting a student with, you know, some support or serving as a mentor. And that's real. And we've got to acknowledge that there's individual relationships there that people value, and you know, I understand that. And I want to be really clear that, you know, none of this is about individual officers. It's really about a model that is, you know, sort of flawed at an institutional level. And with respect to sort of those relationships, I would say that, you know, even when, you know, again, it comes back to the idea that absolutely those relationships are valuable, but even when an officer plays a mentoring role, his or her main job is to enforce the law, including arresting students with whom they have those positive relationships. And we've had clients that have had exactly that experience. And for those students and young people who want a relationship with an officer, to have a sort of engagement with, you know, a member of the police force, they absolutely can and should seek out those opportunities in the community, you know, through police athletic leagues, or, you know, police departments have community events, picnics, and so forth. That's the place to seek those out, because you have a choice about whether or not you go to those events, right? As opposed to when you're in school and you absolutely have to be there. And, you know, you're going to make the mistakes that children make, and you absolutely should be taught and held accountable. But we know that arresting a kid when they get in a fight, or when they mess up in the other ways that children do, because their minds are still developing, and they're still figuring out social cues and relationships and strategies to engage with others. We need to teach them, but having an officer sort of at the ready, you know, responding to one of these incidents, or just, you know, simply witnessing them, and using the law enforcement tools that they have in their toolbox is simply not sort of an effective way to improve that student's behavior and keep the school safe. Let me throw a question out there, sort of for discussion. I'd love folks' input on this question of sort of the tension between the facts and the research that shows that police really haven't made schools safer and have caused some really severe harms, particularly to Black students and students with disabilities, and the sort of emotional, and again, I don't say that in a dismissive way, but the sort of deeply felt support for police officer presence, or feeling that police officer presence is necessary. Have you all experienced that, felt that yourselves, or heard those types of feelings and that tension from the folks you've been in community with? And what do you think is the best way to engage in trying to sort of resolve that tension and that conflict, particularly for an organization like the PJC?
So this is Tara Huffman with the Open Society Institute, Baltimore. In response to your question, I would simply say that it's critical that what I've learned over the years as an advocate is that it's very critical that particularly policymakers hear from their constituents. And so yes, we have the data, we have the science, we have the research and the evaluation that says that these are the best approaches. But, you know, at some point, the professional advocate can't be the messenger. It has to come from those parents, and it has to come from those teachers. And unfortunately, we have to figure out how do we marshal the resources that allow us to adequately, or, you know, from philanthropy, how do we make the investments that allow people to adequately organize, and I don't want to use the word educate parents because I don't want to make it sound like parents are ignorant, but I mean expose parents to other models. I think the way you worded it was perfect. They know one model, and they know the model isn't perfect, but it's the only model that they have. And we have the same experience with judges. Judges always say, if you want me to do something different, then give me the something different you want me to do. But right now, this is what I got, so this is what I'm going to use. And I think it's the same with parents and teachers. And so it's figuring out how do we more aggressively expose parents and teachers to other models of safety that really work, that are proven to work, and that they can see themselves in. Because again, at the end of the day, a parent is just worried about his or her child's safety. A teacher is worried about his or her own safety and the safety of their students and getting their job done. And so it sort of raises the question of, you know, at some point, not do we take a pause, but what's the parallel track while we're running the advocacy track and having conversations with policymakers and gathering the research? What's the parallel track that's running that is organizing these parents and these teachers, exposing them to these models so that it's not us putting our talking points in their mouth, but it's them being exposed to a solution that they've never seen before, and they sign on to it in a genuine way, and then they become the advocates, right? And now all of a sudden we're just following their lead now, right? We're just showing up where they tell us to show up, as opposed to the other way around. And sometimes it feels that way, that we sort of have the strategy and we're asking the teachers and the parents to show up in a particular place. And we do need to flip that paradigm, I think, if we're going to be ultimately successful.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love that perspective, and I absolutely agree with you. I think sort of two things. One, we were really in this space had the opportunity to sort of come behind students and parents and teachers who are already organizing and had been in many cases for years, right? This summer and the protests of this summer provided a new opportunity and new sort of fuel for those, for that organizing effort, you know, on the ground. And we were sort of able to plug into that and provide the tools that these student and parent and teacher-led groups felt would be helpful coming from a legal and policy organization. And that's really been such a wonderful learning experience to be sort of in that space, you know, supporting from behind. And we're lucky because of it that we do have, you know, I was just looking at my list trying to get ready for the hearing next week, and I've got something like 35, you know, parents, teachers, students who have spoken out before and are, you know, interested in doing it again. And, you know, this is a weird year where we definitely can't have everyone who wants to testify, but that's been a shift for me from other advocacy efforts where there hasn't been necessarily that level of leadership on the ground already. I would encourage you all, you know, if you're interested, we did actually a town hall prior to session, a legislative preview in town hall, where we had our sponsors speak on the bill, but really the focus was on 5 different parents, students from all different parts of the state speaking about their experiences. You know, we recorded it, and we've been posting clips from those student and parent testimonies on our social media. Bethany's actually really been heading that up, and you know, I would encourage you to follow us so that you can hear some of those stories, you know, from those who have experienced them.
This is Diana Morris. Maybe I'll follow up to what Tara said, which I think is a really important point. And specifically, some of the concern has been among teachers about what happens if a physical fight breaks out, and what do they do in that circumstance. And it seems to me it would be worthwhile to actually show models that actually address that and accept the legitimacy of those, you know, concerns. There was a model that Open Society supported actually in Baltimore And Michael Sarbanes was involved at that time, and it basically took in community members who were trained and became the kind of counselors you always wanted to have, and were there for the young people really from early in the morning to late, and they really understood what was going on and were there to provide protection and guidance. So, I mean, that's one particular model. There's undoubtedly others, but I do think that's a very particular concern. Maybe the unarmed security guards would do that, fill that need, but there may be many other models that would even be better. And I think that's something that should be addressed as a real concern.
Yeah, I hear you on that, and I agree completely. I'd love to see the Baltimore City model you're talking about, so maybe we can figure out a way to connect so I can get more information on that. You're right, in Toronto, what they did is they'd have school safety monitors who would kind of walk the halls, and they were community members, right? They were folks who actually were known in those communities and, you know, got training in de-escalation. They would be a presence in the hallways. They would engage with students and seek to sort of head off conflicts before they really boiled over and de-escalate them when they did occur. I know in DC, there's also a model where of sort of teams of folks that play sort of a similar role. But yes, you know, our legislation, I think, also contemplates that in addition to investing in counselors and social workers who can really do the long-term school safety work and the immediate, you know, intervening with a kid who's coming to school in crisis that day, there would also be, and there wouldn't be any sort of prohibition on what most districts already have with the sort of unarmed guards that are a presence and can, again, you know, we recognize there may be situations where you do have to call in outside police, probably not most sort of fights, but you know, they're sort of in a position to do that as well if it really becomes necessary. But I agree with that, and I would love to learn more about the Baltimore City model you discussed.
We're just about out of time. Anybody have a last question? And then if not, then I think we can just thank Monisha for her presentation today and the work that she's doing. I know we're working with a number of people in the community and people on this call now, and of course we always it's very important for the Public Justice Center that we be involved in the communities that we're representing, and we certainly welcome all of you to keep in touch with us. We'll send out the materials after this call, but please keep in touch. Any questions you have, any collaboration you want to do, let's keep talking. And thank you, Monisha, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning.
Thanks, everyone.
Say goodbye.
Bye-bye.